The weapon was still warm. Arch-Liaison Vethara noticed it the moment she stepped into the human delegation chamber, a faint heat radiating from the long table where the disarmament documents had been signed 20 minutes earlier. She pressed 2 fingers against the polished surface. Still warm. Not from lamps, not from the ventilation system she had already catalogued. From hands. Human hands, dozens of them, pressing down on that surface in the moments before her people had entered to collect the signed copies. She did not know why that detail unsettled her. She filed it away and said nothing. The ceremony had gone smoothly. The conclave's terms had been accepted. Humanity would surrender its warships within 90 days, dismantle its orbital defense platforms within 60, and transmit full weapon schematics to the Verification Bureau within 30. The representatives had smiled during the signing, shook hands, offered refreshments. They had been entirely, unnervingly calm. The Galactic Conclave had not expected resistance. Why would they? The math was simple, and civilizations operating at the Conclave's tier of development tended to trust their math absolutely. Humanity controlled 11 star systems. The Conclave represented 412. Humanity's combined fleet tonnage was roughly 0.3% of the Conclave's active naval strength. Their most advanced weapon, a fusion lance platform deployed around their homeworld, had been rendered effectively obsolete by Conclave countermeasure technology 6 years before the ultimatum was ever issued. When the ultimatum arrived, the wording had been deliberately courteous. The Conclave's senior diplomatic architect, a Velhari elder named Sorvan Death, had spent considerable effort making it sound like an invitation rather than a demand. He was proud of that. He had told his subordinates that civilizations accepted disarmament more gracefully when they were allowed to believe it was their own idea. The humans had requested 48 hours to deliberate. They had come back in 31. Sorvan Death had considered that a good sign. Fast agreement meant low resistance. Low resistance meant smooth integration. He had noted in his official record that humanity was cooperating at a rate 12% above projected model outcomes, and he had flagged humanity's file for potential early reclassification from managed species to transitional member. He had not yet updated that file. Something kept stopping him, though he could not have said precisely what. The first mystery was this. Of all the humans present at the signing, not one had argued. They had read every clause. They had asked questions, intelligent, specific questions about verification timelines, inspection protocols, the process for filing appeals. But they had not argued against the terms themselves. Not once. In Sorvan Death's considerable experience, civilizations facing disarmament always argued. Even civilizations that intended to comply argued, because arguing was how they preserved dignity. It was nearly universal behavior across dozens of integrated species. Humans had not argued. They had only asked questions about process. The second thing no one could explain was the silence from the human military command. In the 72 hours following the signing, the Conclave's monitoring array expected to detect the standard behavioral signatures, encrypted fleet communications, emergency command sessions, possibly some minor repositioning of warships under the pretext of routine patrol adjustment. Every species did this. It was not considered a violation. It was considered expected, even rational, the natural reflex of a military apparatus that had just been told to prepare for its own dissolution. Human military channels went quiet, not the quiet of reduced traffic, the complete quiet of channels that had been deliberately deactivated. Vethara flagged this to Sorvan Death. He reviewed her report, compared it to the monitoring data, and told her she was probably measuring baseline incorrectly. "They've gone dark before," he said. "It's a posturing behavior. They'll come back online within a week, probably with some demonstration designed to show us they're still capable of." "They haven't gone dark," Vethara said. "Their civilian networks are fully active. Commerce, communication, cultural transmission, all nominal. Only their military channels are silent. That's not posturing. Posturing requires an audience. They've closed the channels we were watching, not the channels they need." Sorvan Death studied her for a moment. "Your implication being—" "I don't have an implication yet," she said. That's what concerns me. The third mystery arrived on day 11, and it arrived wearing the shape of a question so small that almost no one took it seriously. A junior analyst in the verification bureau named Thessaly Corden, she was human, one of approximately 400 humans employed in administrative roles throughout the Conclave's apparatus, a detail that would later seem significant, submitted a routine verification inquiry about the first scheduled weapons transfer. The inquiry asked for confirmation of which specific tracking identifiers the Conclave would use to verify that the Fusion Lance platforms had been powered down, as opposed to merely disconnected from their targeting systems. It was a reasonable question. It was the kind of question a compliance officer asks. Except Thessaly Corden was not a compliance officer. She was a xenolinguistic archives specialist. She had no official role in the disarmament process whatsoever. Her supervisor flagged the inquiry as misfiled and sent it back. She resubmitted it 3 days later through a different channel, this time attributed to a verification task force that, when cross-checked, turned out to have been dissolved 8 months prior. The inquiry was flagged again, sent back again. Thessaly Corden submitted it a third time. Then she stopped coming to work. When the bureau sent someone to follow up, her apartment was clean, her personal effects were gone, and the building's occupancy records showed she had terminated her lease 6 days before submitting the first inquiry. She had been filing the questions from somewhere else. No one knew where. No one could find her. And the questions she had been asking, about tracking identifiers, about the specific methodology the Conclave would use to confirm weapons had been truly disabled versus merely concealed, remained, quietly, unanswered. Sorvan Death received Vethara's compiled report on all 3 anomalies during what should have been a routine status briefing. He read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk with the particular care of someone placing a fragile object on an uncertain surface. "You think they're planning something," he said. "I think they're already doing something," Vethara said. "I think they were doing it before they signed. To what end? Their strategic position is. I know what their strategic position is," she paused. "I'm saying it might not be the position they're operating from." The room was quiet for a moment. "Pull everything we have on their historical conflict doctrine," Sorvan Death said. "Not recent, early, pre-spaceflight." Vethara had already done this. What she had found was why she hadn't slept in 4 days. Human military history, examined at scale, contained a pattern that the Conclave's initial assessment had flagged as statistically interesting, and then filed without further analysis. The pattern was this. In approximately 67% of conflicts where humanity had faced a technologically or numerically superior adversary, the initial phase of the conflict had involved deliberate, coordinated concealment of actual military capacity. Not retreat, not regrouping, concealment. Humans had a word for it, several words actually, drawn from dozens of languages across their history, but the concept was consistent. Make the enemy believe they understand your capability, then operate from the capability they don't know about. The Conclave's assessment had flagged this as a historical curiosity from a pre-spaceflight civilization that no longer applied, because humanity's military capacity was fully mapped by Conclave intelligence. Every ship, every platform, every weapons system, every system that humanity had reported. Vethara sat with that distinction for a long time. The question she could not answer, the one that had been keeping her awake, was not what are they hiding. It was something much worse. It was, how long ago did they start hiding it? On day 19, the first warships arrived for decommissioning. They were exactly as catalogued. Hull registry matched, weapons systems present, crew manifests accurate to within rounding tolerances. The Conclave's inspection teams boarded them, ran verification sweeps, found nothing unexpected. The ships were old. Some of them were very old. One cruiser, the Perseverance, had a commission date that made 2 of the Conclave inspectors laugh. It had been built before humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel. It barely qualified as a warship by any modern metric. The inspection team lead, a Kelhari officer named Grass, sent his report back to the Bureau with a note that read, "These are not combat assets. These are museum pieces. Recommend expediting the symbolic gesture of accepting them and moving forward. Sorvan Death approved the recommendation. That evening, Vethara went back through the asset registries, not the ones submitted by humanity, but the Conclave's own surveillance records, assembled over the previous decade of monitoring. She was looking for the ships humanity hadn't sent, the ones that appeared in long-range sensor data in trade manifests, in the background of recorded communications, but had never been formally registered with the Bureau. She found 43 discrepancies, small ones, things that could each be individually explained as sensor error, misidentification, or data corruption. 43 of them. She was still building the spreadsheet when her terminal received an automated alert from the Conclave's deep space monitoring network. A sensor relay in the Kurath Expanse, a region of navigational difficulty roughly 30 light-years from human-controlled space, had just registered a power signature it couldn't classify. Then the relay went offline. Then 7 more relays went offline in a pattern that moved in a single direction. Then silence. "They're not disarming," Vethara said. She said it quietly, to an empty office, to no one in particular, because the person she needed to tell was 3 floors away, and she already knew what he was going to say. She was wrong about one thing. She thought she understood what was happening. She thought the humans were stalling, running out the clock while something repositioned, some hidden fleet moving through the Kurath Expanse toward a staging point, some last act of defiance before integration overwhelmed them. She did not yet understand that this was not a last act. She did not understand that the disarmament they had agreed to, signed, and begun executing was the plan. Sorvan Death received her in his office without ceremony. He looked at the relay data. He looked at the discrepancy report. He was quiet for a long time. "If this is what you think it is," he finally said, "then we have a problem." "What I think it is," Vethara said, "is that they're moving something. Something large and something that has been positioned carefully enough that we didn't notice it until it started moving, which means it was stationary for long enough to be invisible," Sorvan Death said. He understood immediately. How long? Based on the relay progression, she calculated. Minimum 4 years. The silence in the room was of a very specific quality. "They were planning this before we issued the ultimatum," Sorvan Death said. "Before," Vethara confirmed. He stood. He walked to the window. Outside, the Conclave's administrative center spread in every direction, a monument to 400 years of ordered galactic governance, of species integrated, managed, transitioned, improved. He had given his entire adult life to this institution and had never once doubted its fundamental logic. That order, applied with sufficient force and patience, was the only sustainable path through the galaxy's chaos. "What are they doing?" he asked. It was the first time in 23 years of diplomatic service that Sorvan Death had asked a question he genuinely did not have a working theory for. The answer, when it came sideways, as the most important answers tend to. It came through a translation archive. Specifically, through a file that Thessaly Corden had been quietly maintaining for 18 months before she disappeared, embedded in the routine backup logs of the Xenolinguistic Department, camouflaged as corrupted data packets that had never triggered any alert because they were, technically, exactly what they appeared to be. Background noise in a system full of background noise. A human analyst in the Bureau's own archival department found it. He reported it. When the first senior officer who reviewed the file understood what it contained, she transmitted it to Sorvan Death without explanation, flagged priority red, and then immediately requested reassignment to a position on the other side of Conclave space. He approved the transfer without asking why. He understood why after reading the file. Thessaly Corden had not been asking about tracking identifiers to help humanity stall or deceive. She had been asking because she needed to know, needed to document precisely and in detail, exactly what the Conclave could and could not verify, not to find gaps in verification. To confirm there were none. She had been building a legal record. The file contained 840 pages of communication logs, internal conclave memos, surveillance data, treaty language analysis, and historical precedent, assembled with the specific, obsessive thoroughness of someone building a case. Not a military case, a legal case. filed not with any authority that currently existed, but referenced repeatedly to something called the Tharsis Accord Protocol, a dormant clause buried in conclave founding law that had never been invoked, because no one had ever believed the conditions for invoking it could be met. The conditions required a member species to demonstrate that the conclave itself had violated galactic law by coercing disarmament through threat of force, without documented evidence of hostile action by the disarmed party. The conditions required proof that the conclave had acted as an aggressor, and Thessaly Corden, in 840 pages, had assembled exactly that proof. She had been filing it with the Founding Archive, through the dissolved task force's credentials, because the Founding Archive was the one body the Conclave's Executive Council could not overrule, could not access without quorum, and could not suppress without triggering an automatic external audit. The third submission, the one filed from her now empty apartment, had been received and logged. It was sitting in the Founding Archive right now, immovable, irrefutable, waiting. The legal challenge would go active the moment someone with standing filed a formal request for review, which meant the humans had not surrendered. They had filed charges. Sorvan Death read the file 4 times before he fully understood what he was looking at. Then he sat down slowly, the way people sit down when their legs have decided the situation warrants it, and pressed both hands flat against the surface of his desk. Warm. He thought of the table in the signing chamber. He thought of Vethara saying they've closed the channels we were watching, not the channels they need. He thought of 43 discrepancies in the registry, and sensor relays going offline in a pattern that moved in one direction, and a legal case assembled with the patience of people who had known, years in advance, what was coming. He thought of the old cruiser, the Perseverance. He thought about what kind of people name a ship that. Vethara found him like that, hands on the desk, staring at nothing. She had the relay data updates under her arm and the look of someone who had run out of ways to make information sound less catastrophic. "They're not moving toward us," she said. "The power signatures in the Curath expanse, they're not a fleet positioning for engagement." "What are they doing?" She set the data down in front of him. "They're broadcasting." Sorvan Death looked at the signal analysis. The power signatures from the Curath expanse were transmission arrays. Dozens of them distributed across a vast arc of space, all activated in sequence, all pointing not at conclave space but at the outer reach, the contested fringe of the galaxy where a dozen smaller civilizations existed in various states of uneasy alliance with conclave governance. Broadcasting Thessaly Corden's archive, every page, every memo, every surveillance record the conclave had generated while monitoring humanity, now turned outward as evidence, transmitted to every civilization in the outer reach that had ever quietly wondered whether the conclave's integration process was quite as voluntary as it claimed. "How many have received it?" Sorvan Death asked. Vethara was quiet for a moment. "The better question," she finally said, "is how many responded." She pulled up a second screen. 14 civilizations had already transmitted formal acknowledgement signals, not to the conclave, to humanity. 3 of them had been integrated species, member worlds, who technically had no standing to communicate independently with outside parties. They had done it anyway. The conclave's legal framework contained no precedent for what happened when a species under disarmament simultaneously filed legal charges, provided evidence of institutional misconduct to 14 galactic parties, and did so using a communication infrastructure that the conclave hadn't known existed, from a location the conclave hadn't known was occupied. The galaxy had gone quiet because it was reading. In a small transit station at the edge of human space, the kind of place that appeared in no official registry, that had been described in supply manifests only as Maintenance Waypoint 7G for the last 6 years, a woman named Commander Dara Holly's Fen sat across a folding table from a Kelhari logistics officer who had defected 11 months ago and whose name did not appear in any conclave record. His name was Arath. He was drinking something hot. He looked exhausted. "They're reading the archive," Dara said. She was looking at a tablet. She did not look surprised. "How long until the conclave moves to suppress it?" Arath asked. "They can't, that's the whole point." She set the tablet down. The moment they try to block transmission of the archive, they confirm everything in it. The moment they do nothing, it spreads further. They have no good option. Arith was quiet. Your people understood this from the beginning. From before the beginning, she said. We knew the ultimatum was coming 14 months before it arrived. We had people in the Conclave's administrative offices, not intelligence assets, just employees. People doing their jobs, noticing things, understanding what those things meant. And you said nothing. You let it come. Dara met his eyes. We needed them to issue the ultimatum. We needed them to be on record demanding our disarmament with no documented justification. We needed to sign the agreement while the archive was already in transit. She paused. You can't file charges without a crime. We waited for them to commit one. Arith looked at her for a long time. He had lived among humans for 11 months. He had learned a great deal about them, and he had revised his understanding of them repeatedly, and he had believed several times that he finally understood what they were doing. What did you give up? He asked quietly. The ships you sent to decommissioning, the 47 vessels in the first wave, were any of them real assets? Dara considered her answer. The Perseverance was real. You decommissioned a real warship. One, she said, as a gesture because the gesture needed to be authentic. And the others were what we needed them to see. She stood. Arith. How many species in the outer reach have your people ever successfully suppressed after they went public with documentation of Conclave misconduct? He knew the answer. There had been 2 attempts in Conclave history. Both had ended with the suppression effort becoming its own evidence. None, he said. Then you understand why we're not worried about the next move. She picked up her tablet. We're not fighting the Conclave. We never were. You can't fight something that size and win. A pause. You can make it look at itself. Sorvan Death understood this on day 26. He understood it at approximately 3 in the morning, in his office, surrounded by reports, with a cup of something cold sitting forgotten at his elbow. He understood it the way you understand something when you have been consciously avoiding understanding it for long enough that the avoidance itself becomes exhausting. Humanity had never planned to win a military conflict. They had planned to make one unnecessary. The disarmament, the compliance, the calm, the warm table, the ships delivered precisely as promised, had been the mechanism, not the concession. By complying visibly and completely, by creating a clean record of cooperation while simultaneously transmitting evidence of coercion to parties with independent standing, they had built a legal structure around the Conclave that the Conclave could not dismantle without making it worse. They had done it in plain sight. They had done it while smiling and offering refreshments. He pressed both hands against his desk again. The surface was room temperature. Of course it was. It had been hours since anyone else was here. He thought about what Vethara had said. They've closed the channels we were watching. He thought about 43 ships. He thought about a junior archivist who had filed 3 identical inquiries from a location no one could find, who had terminated her lease before she started, who had vanished into the same careful infrastructure that had hidden communication arrays in a navigational hazard zone for 4 years. He thought about a civilization that had looked at the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, done the math, and decided that the most dangerous thing they could deploy was a legal document. He thought they were never afraid of us. He thought they never needed to be. The formal review request arrived at the founding archive on day 29. It was filed by a coalition of 7 outer reach civilizations, 3 of them Conclave member worlds. The filing cited the Tharsis Accord Protocol and referenced the archive by case number. The number Thessaly Corden had assigned it 18 months ago, long before the ultimatum, long before the signing, in a document that had been sitting in the founding archive the entire time, quiet and patient, waiting for someone to pull the thread. The Conclave could not block the review, could not delay it, could not control its scope or appoint its adjudicators. The silence in the Conclave's Executive Council chamber when the notification arrived lasted 11 minutes. No one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, because they were each, privately, performing the same calculation, tracking backwards through the timeline, looking for the moment they could have seen this coming, and finding only a signing ceremony with warm tables and calm faces and questions about process that they had heard as compliance and should have heard as archaeology. The humans had been digging up the Conclave's legal foundations long before the Conclave thought to look. Vithara requested a meeting with Sor von Death on day 31. She sat across from him. The reports between them were largely irrelevant at this point. Procedural documents, monitoring updates, adjustments to a situation that was already beyond adjustment. "They're going to win," she said. "Yes," he said. "Not because they were stronger. No. Not because they were better equipped or better positioned or because they had something we didn't have. No," he said again. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Conclave's administrative center was continuing, ships moving, commerce flowing, the vast institutional machinery turning over as it always had. But something in it felt different today. Something felt observed. "They're dangerous," she said, "because they looked at the rules and figured out which ones we wrote and which ones we couldn't break without destroying ourselves." Sor von Death looked out the window. "There is a word in human strategic theory," he said, "an old one from their pre-spaceflight period, judo, a combat discipline built around using an adversary's own force against them." He paused. "I read about it 6 years ago when we were compiling their civilization assessment. I flagged it as historically interesting, and filed it without further analysis," Vithara said. "And filed it without further analysis," he agreed. Commander Dara Holly's Fenn was not present for any of what followed. She was on a shuttle 17 hours into a transit toward a Conclave medical facility, because Arith had finally told her what he'd noticed 3 weeks ago but hadn't known how to say. The reason she kept pausing mid-sentence, the reason her coordination in the left hand had been slightly off, was not exhaustion. She had known before he told her. She had known for months. She had scheduled the medical appointment and then kept moving the appointment because there was always one more thing, one more file to transmit, one more relay to bring online. The archive had needed to be finished first. It was finished now. She sat in the shuttle and looked out the window at nothing in particular and thought about the Perseverance, the real one, the old one, the ship that had been stripped of its weapons systems and handed over in plain sight as a gesture of cooperation. She had served on that ship for 2 years, early in her career, before she'd been pulled into the work that had consumed the last 8 years of her life. She had not known, when she served on it, that it would one day be the most visible piece of a plan she hadn't yet been recruited for. She thought about Thessaly Corden, wherever she was. She thought about Arith, who had given up his entire life to provide the internal documentation the archive needed to be credible. 12 years of Conclave logistics records, quietly copied, carefully preserved. She thought about what they had all lost, and what they had all agreed, without ever directly saying it to each other, that loss was for. The Founding Archives Review Board published its preliminary findings on day 44. The Conclave's disarmament ultimatum had been issued without the documentary evidence of hostile action required by galactic law. The coercion threshold had been met. The Tharsis Accord protocol's conditions had been satisfied. The disarmament agreement was legally void. The Conclave was required to restore all surrendered assets, required to open its internal review process to external audit for the first time in its 400-year history, required to submit its integration protocols for independent assessment. The vote in the Founding Archive had been unanimous. 7 civilizations in the Outer Reach formally requested elevation to full independent status outside Conclave oversight, citing the review's findings. 2 more filed similar requests within a week. The Conclave's Executive Council spent 4 days in emergency session. They emerged with a statement acknowledging the review's authority and expressing commitment to the audit process, language that translated in practical terms to, "We have no remaining option that does not make this worse." Sor von Death submitted his resignation on day 50. He submitted it quietly, without ceremony. He had been a diplomat for 23 years. He had negotiated treaties with 11 species, managed integration processes for 7, and written the framework document that had guided the Conclave's expansion policy for the past decade. He cleared his desk with the careful efficiency of someone who had long ago decided which things mattered and which things could be let go. Before he left, he looked at the desk one final time. He pressed both hands flat against the surface. room temperature. He had spent weeks thinking about that detail, the warm table, the signing ceremony, the thing he had noticed and Vethara had not mentioned. He had spent weeks constructing explanations for it, discarding them, rebuilding them. He had eventually stopped. Some details were not clues. Some details were just the warmth left behind by people who knew exactly what they were doing and were not frightened, and who had held on to that surface for a moment, not from hesitation, but the way people hold on to things when they are about to do something that cannot be undone, and they want one last contact with something solid. He understood that now. He understood it the way he understood everything about them, too late, too completely, with the particular clarity of hindsight that felt less like wisdom and more like witnessing. He picked up his bag. He left. Dara received the preliminary findings from a hospital room. She was sitting up. The window beside her showed a slice of a small human colony's sky, the kind of sky that didn't make it into any official record, orange at the edges where the local star was setting, genuinely unremarkable, genuinely beautiful. She read the findings on a tablet propped against her knee. She read them twice. She set the tablet down. She did not celebrate. She had been too tired for celebrations for a long time, and she had known this outcome was coming for long enough that the arrival felt less like a victory and more like the completion of a very long sentence she'd been writing for 8 years. Arith called her that evening. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Complicated," she said. "The council is already spinning the narrative, framing it as a procedural adjustment." "They'll do that for a while," she said. "It doesn't matter. The audit is proceeding. The outer reach filings are proceeding. The thing about legal structures is that they're very hard to unbuild once they're built." She paused. "That's why we built one." "Thessaly has surfaced," Arith said. "She's in the Veil system. She wants to know if she can come home." Dara was quiet for a moment. "Tell her yes," she said. "Tell her," she stopped, started again. "Tell her the archive is in the record permanently. Tell her it took." A pause from his end. "You knew it would," Arith said. "I knew it had to," she said. "There's a difference." She set the communicator down. Outside, the sky had gone fully dark. The colony's lights were coming on below, small and warm and entirely ordinary. She thought about the Perseverance. About the years the ship had carried people from one place to another without anyone asking too carefully about where it had been built or why it was still running. About the name. About why, of all the ships in the first decommissioning wave, she had made sure that one was real. Not as a sacrifice. As a signature. The Conclave would audit. The Outer Reach would reorganize. The legal framework humanity had built, not in warships, not in weapons, but in 840 pages of someone else's records, turned carefully outward, would outlast the careers of everyone who had opposed it, and most of the careers of everyone who had built it. The galaxy had gone quiet when it read the archive. It would not go back to the noise it had been making before. Some things, once known, could not be unknown. Some structures, once built in plain sight, could not be quietly demolished. And some civilizations, the small ones, the ones everyone had already calculated into acceptable losses, had a way of making the calculation itself the weapon. Humanity had not defeated the Conclave. It had simply refused to participate in the version of events where defeat was the only available outcome. It had done so patiently, carefully, over years, in full view of every monitoring system the Conclave deployed, and the monitoring systems had watched and recorded and filed reports that said, cooperation proceeding at 12% above projections. The galaxy, now reading those reports alongside Thessaly Cordon's archive, was understanding something for the first time. Something that would take decades to fully articulate, and that every species in the Outer Reach would quietly carry forward into every interaction they ever had with humanity afterward. The Conclave had ordered them to disarm. They had complied completely. And in complying, in placing their hands on that table, in signing every document with careful precision, in delivering their oldest ship with its ancient hull and its impossible name, they had built, from the act of surrender itself, something the Conclave had no framework to fight. Not because humans were the strongest species in the galaxy. Not because they were the most advanced, or the most numerous, or the most feared. but because they were the species that looked at the mathematics of a situation where they could not win and quietly decided that the mathematics were asking the wrong question. And they had all the patience in the world. They had been practicing patience for a very long time.